Yo, what's cracking everyone? Dom here from Lensprotogo and Lens Rentals. Welcome back to the channel. So this is going to be a Lumix GH6 video today, but let me just start out by painting a little picture here for you. You're a GH5 shooter, and this thing has been your little Micro Four Thirds workhorse for like years now. It takes excellent 4K video up to 300 megabytes per second. You've been shooting and grading that vlog footage, and that's been working really well, looking good. It also has excellent in-body image stabilization, which we all know, and perhaps overlooked, your selection of Micro Four Thirds lenswear is growing and growing over the years and headed in a more cine direction, which is super cool. But you are now thinking about upgrading from the GH5, which is a superstar camera for all of the reasons I just mentioned, but it is, of course, getting a little bit behind in terms of video tech now. And so, if you've been paying attention to Lumix camera releases since the GH5 has come out, you would see that a GH5 upgrader like yourself actually has a few options to consider. There's the recently released GH5 II, which is obviously the updated version to the original GH5, but there's also the Lumix S5, the smallest and cheapest body in Lumix's full-frame S line, which include the S1, the S1R, the S1H, but of course now we've got the GH6, a whole entirely new body to the GH line with a bunch of standout features of its own, and the topic of this week's video. So in this video, we are going to talk about what is new with the GH6, except we're going to be talking about what's new with this camera in terms of coming from the GH5, because there have been a couple of other models since the GH5 and the GH6, like the GH5S and also the GH5 II. But I wanted to make this video from the perspective of somebody upgrading from the GH5 to the GH6, because I just have a feeling that the user base of the GH5 is so much greater than those other two models. The GH5S was kind of niche, and the GH5 II just hasn't been really out for that long. And the GH5 is just probably the model that more people are curious about upgrading from. And then on the other side of that coin, we'll chat about whether or not the GH6 is going to be worth that upgrade for you, or if there is another turn down Lumix lane that is going to suit you better. So let's jump right in and talk about what is new with the GH6, and again, this is going to be from the perspective of the GH5. So first thing, on a physical level, we have some big changes here for sure. Changes that we did not get on the GH5 II. So it really seemed like Lumix wanted to save this big body rebuild for this model. The GH6 has a much beefier build than the GH5. My first impression of the GH6 after picking it up was that it felt and even looked a lot more like one of the full-frame Lumix S-series cameras, like the S1 or this S5 here. Not like a newer GH5, but something totally different. That added bulkiness is mainly coming from the inclusion of some really serious cooling hardware going on the GH6. You can see these large intake and exhaust vents here, and that should be a sign right off the bat that this thing is ready to take some video now and ask questions later. The grip is also much deeper on the GH6 compared to the 5, and also the grip material is a smoother, firmer rubber than the tackier rubber of the GH5's grip. The combination of that larger build and deeper grip give the GH6 an excellent handle while shooting handheld video, a great improvement from the GH5. And also this sets the LCD back in the body a bit too, which I like. It gives it a lot of space to clear these inputs and outputs, which can always get annoying on cameras like of this size when the screen gets in the way of those. That LCD screen is actually slightly smaller than the GH5's, but with greater resolution. The EVF is the same though, as far as I can tell, and so are the inputs and outputs. You get a full-size HDMI, USB-C, headphone, and microphone. Button layout is going to be familiar to the GH5, but with a few changes for sure. Nothing is labeled a function button anymore, and your Q menu, back button, and display toggle are laid out like this now, while our thumbstick and AF mode switch are pushed over a little, with the AF zone button in the middle and the AF on next to that switch. Our rear dial is now external, as you can see, and right here is a button that's basically like a quick menu for audio stuff. So That's really helpful. Also, we get a camera lock switch on the GH6 to the left of the EVF here, next to that media button, and the EVF toggle button is now directly on the side of that EVF. On the front of the camera are two assignable buttons, as well as an extra record button near the bottom. As for other build and design stuff, again, some of these design choices to me are reminiscent of the Lumix S series, with the solid red metallic record buttons. The white lettering pops out a little bit more than the gray of the GH5, and its body just features more hard geometries on it now rather than the more smooth, curvy profile of the 5. So if you thought that that was a lot of change just build-wise, wait until you figure out that this thing has an entirely rebuilt sensor. I mean, like, obviously, right? The GH5 2 didn't get a different sensor at all from the GH5 1, so the GH6 had to have something really different. And this new sensor build is something that Lumix is really boasting about the GH6. It's a 25.2 megapixel live MOS micro four thirds image sensor, capable of a 5.7K image area, and even given the sensor's smaller photo sites that made room for that increased resolution, the camera actually achieves an even higher dynamic range than the GH5, testing at 13 plus stops. Interestingly, the build of this sensor, which excludes the use of a low-pass filter, will be able to resolve moires in video much more effectively, Lumix claims, especially when that video is met with the new Venus engine processor of the GH6 down the line. I'll also take this time to mention quickly that the IBIS on the GH6 is improved from the GH5. Now paired with compatible lenses, the GH6 and lens will achieve 7.5 stops of stabilization, so quite impressive there. And another awesome thing, special electronic stabilization for anamorphic lenses in various stretch factors. And this new sensor is definitely impressive, although a lot of these things wouldn't even be possible if the camera wasn't recording out to a super fast piece of media, CF Express Type B, which we'll talk about in a second, but let's chat about some of these recording modes, because this sophisticated cooling system, that super fast media, all of these things should be hinting at you that this thing has some serious recording modes. First off, I'll start with those 5.7K recording modes because we know that those weren't on the GH5. The GH6 is going to let you record 5.7K video, which is 5728 by 3024 pixels, up to 60 frames per second. Though the greatest amount of the sensor area is used in the 5.7K anamorphic profile of 5760 by 4320 pixels, though this is only up to 30p. These 5.7K modes are offered in either .mov movie containers or in an ultra-fast ProRes 422 mode with your choice of HQ or not. And this video can only be captured to CF Express media and only goes up to 30 frames per second. But in that 5.7K 30 FPS ProRes 422 HQ mode, that's an insanely fast and spacious 1900 megabytes per second video bit speed. I'm pretty sure I took around like a 7-minute video in this recording mode, and that was around 100 gigs. Other than its 5.7K modes, well, it seems the major video stat as of recent that the GH6 absolutely had to have is 4K 120. Which the GH6 will record in its H.264 long GOP format in 422 10-bit or in H.265 420 10-bit. Either way, put a check mark in that box. And speaking of high frame rates, the GH6 is also going to do 300 frames per second in full HD in the H.265 mode as well, which looks really, really good. So my big takeaways for those recording modes. First of all, I'm loving all of that anamorphic support that Lumix is giving you here. I think they really listened to their community with that one and gave us some of those features with the GH6. But also, if that didn't mean anything to you, just that added resolution is really helpful for a lot of other applications too. 4K 120 FPS was absolutely needed. It kind of would have been a flop without that. And as I just mentioned, that 300 FPS full HD looks really good, and that's a really cool tool to have at your disposal. The real powerhouse stat that we are talking about here though is that ProRes 422 HQ recorded internally. That is hugely professional and so legit of this thing to be able to do that. And as I've said like 5 times in this video already, that is absolutely because of the inclusion of that CF Express Type B media that they gave the GH6 in addition to a high-speed SD card slot. For example, that ProRes shooting mode is exclusively going to go to CF Express Type B, can't go to an SD card. And that's the same for a lot of the other higher bit speed recording modes in the movie profile. Anything over 600 Mbps pretty much. So that's going to be the 4K 60 recording modes in all intra in 48 and 60p, and also that 300 frames per second full HD mode. One thing that's really awesome and helpful, almost every profile that's exclusively a CF Express recording mode has a little H icon at the bottom. And for every one of those, there is a lower bitrate option with a little L underneath that. That's the same recording mode, but it's able to be recorded to an SD. It just sort of like bottlenecks the bitrate so it stays underneath 600 megabytes per second. I think this is a really, really smart move by Lumix. It really alleviates a lot of the stress and possible frustration that you could be experiencing as you're like rifling through all those recording modes and you didn't necessarily know which type of recording mode your media was going to allow you to do. So very well thought out there. And guess what? Your media isn't the only thing that's going to determine what you're able to shoot on the GH6. You also need the right kind of battery. It comes with a new spruced up DMW BLK22 battery pack, which is the same form factor of the old GH series battery, the DMW BLF19, but powering the GH6 with the old battery will lock you out of many recording profiles, giving you this battery error. And as far as I can tell, it's all of the high frame rate modes, as well as the 5.7K modes, and of course, the ProRes modes, all of which have to be powered with the new battery. So that's certainly something to consider if the GH6 is going to be joining your GH5 on a shoot and you're planning on swapping out some accessories. All right, there's one last thing I want to chat about with the GH6. It's got one last trick up its sleeve that I want to chat about before we talk about if this thing is worth upgrading to. And that is unlimited recording times in certain shooting modes. You may have seen this coming from the cooling hardware thing, but the GH6 will record 4K 60 FPS for an unlimited amount of time. And to do this, I'm pretty sure you might have to set this thermal management setting to high, where it literally warns you that touching the camera in this state may cause injury from heat.
Update here, the GH6 just recorded 4K 60 422 10-bit all intra for like 42 minutes, I think, and it is still like lukewarm. It did not get to that dangerously hot to the touch temperature like it warned me it was going to. So final overheating update on this thing. This has now been rolling 5.7K 60 FPS video for an hour. It's a little bit hotter than the 4K 60 test, but still perfectly fine. Definitely not too hot to touch by any means.
Okay, so transitioning over to the part of the video where we chat about if the GH6 is going to be worth upgrading for you, or if there are some other Lumix bodies out there worth considering. So if I had you towards the beginning of this video when we were talking about the total revamp of the build of the GH6, well, those were definitely much needed improvements that really set this apart. But I'm willing to bet that that probably isn't enough to get you to pounce on the GH6 like alone. What I think really necessitates the use of the GH6 is going to be those really beefy recording modes. 5.7K ProRes recorded internally is a serious heavy hitter stat and gives the GH6 big time professional points in my book, and makes cutting this footage together with footage from a real cinema camera a total possibility. And if ProRes recording doesn't really mean anything to you, surely you're happy about 4K 120 FPS shooting, even if you don't do much of that. it's just fun, like as a recreational activity. Go out and shoot some 4K 120. It's just like enjoyable. And also, I'm really loving all of that anamorphic support that we get with the GH6. Those special anamorphic recording modes, and also other tools that just make anamorphic shooting easier, like that E-stabilization. Also, unlimited recording times in 4K up to 60 FPS. That is big. Honestly, not something I really run into personally a lot of the times, but I know that is going to be a big thing for a lot of people. As I've made perfectly clear though, I really don't think you're going to get all that the GH6 has to offer unless it's paired up with one of those CF Express Type B cards. You could get by with a high-speed SD card, but you're really not getting everything out of this camera without one of those cards, and that's something to consider because those are very expensive. Speaking of price, the GH6 is a $2,200 camera body, which in the scope of like what this camera is competing with is still pretty affordable, but say it's the case that you didn't actually necessarily need all these fully loaded stats of the GH6. Well, I've mentioned the GH5 II a couple of times in this video, which is priced at a very friendly $1,500. That's going to have your dual SD card slots, so you don't have to worry about that new media. It's still going to do 4K, 60 FPS in DCI and UHD. It also has some of those anamorphic shooting modes, so that's really nice. Or, kind of a curveball option here, the S5. Also a very video-capable Lumix mirrorless camera, but would give you a huge edge in the photo department too, being a full-frame camera. Obviously, I know that's a little bit bigger of a jump because it's just going to be a whole nother lens investment that you have to make. But as I was writing this video and trying to think of like the person upgrading from the GH5, I was really thinking like the S5 is like a seriously, like think about that. But also, if you really did need all of those really beefed up recording modes, that is something that the S5 is not going to have on the Lumix GH6. Alrighty y'all, that is pretty much going to wrap up this video covering what's new with the Lumix GH6. And I can say y'all, okay, because we're partnered with Lens Rentals from Tennessee, okay? So if you have any questions or insights about the GH6 or any ideas for GH6 content you want to see in the channel, let me know in the comment section below and we'll start a discussion. Also, if you happen to like this video, hit me with that thumbs up button down there. And also, if you haven't noticed, we are barreling close to that 100,000 subscriber milestone. So if you are subscribed, you're cooler than the other side of the pillow. And if you aren't subscribed, you're like the side of the pillow that's like all warm and drool covered. Just kidding. But hit that subscribe button, and when you do, you can even hit that little bell button that's next to the subscribe button, and that'll keep you notified whenever we post new content, which is every week. So keep it cool, everybody. And we'll see you in the next one.